All right, so you're here because you want to know more about what's going on between the U.S. and Russia. Well, today's November 20th, 2024, and things are getting really tense between these two global superpowers. We're going to be looking at this CNBC article today, and it outlines a pretty wild situation going on. The U.S. Embassy in Kyiv has actually shut down. They're saying it's because of a potential air attack threat, so buckle up. Things are about to get interesting.
Yeah, this is not your everyday embassy closure. This is something that only happens under really extreme circumstances when there's a very real threat to U.S. personnel.
The article says that the closure was out of an abundance of caution. I don't know, it seems a little understated for such a serious situation. What do you think?
Well, in diplomacy, that phrase, out of an abundance of caution, actually means a lot more than it sounds. It's like saying, we have intel that suggests a very high probability of an attack, and we're not taking any chances.
So they basically shut everything down and got people out of there. Yeah, that definitely adds a lot more weight to that statement. And this article also goes on to say that the U.S. received specific information of a potential significant air attack. It doesn't sound like just a random threat. What makes an attack significant enough for the U.S. to take this kind of action?
Well, in this context, significant probably means an attack with the potential to cause serious damage. We could be talking about casualties, widespread disruption, maybe even attacks on strategic targets.
And this all comes at a time when there are reports of Ukraine potentially using those U.S.-supplied long-range missiles, the 18CMS, to strike inside of Russia for the first time. I mean, this is huge. Ukraine would be able to hit targets deep inside Russia, potentially even reaching Moscow. Do you think that's just a coincidence?
Oh, the timing of this is way too close to be a coincidence. Those missiles would change the entire game of this war. They give Ukraine the ability to strike back at Russia's military infrastructure.
And I imagine Russia isn't too thrilled about that, are they?
Well, no, not at all. For months, Russia's been saying this whole thing is a defensive operation in response to NATO expansion. They want to look like the victim. But if Ukraine can now hit back at Russia using advanced American weapons, that narrative completely falls apart.
Yeah, it kind of feels like a line's been crossed.
Yeah, exactly. And it puts Russia in a tough spot. They're going to have to rethink their whole strategy and potentially escalate things even further.
Speaking of escalation, let's talk about the U.S. providing these weapons in the first place. Doesn't that seem a bit risky?
It is a risk, for sure. On one hand, it shows the U.S. is committed to helping Ukraine defend itself. But on the other, it could be seen as a provocation by Russia, giving them more fuel to claim that the West is directly involved in this conflict.
So basically, the U.S. is trying to walk this fine line between helping Ukraine defend itself without escalating the conflict even more.
You got it.
And on top of all that, this CNBC article also talks about something pretty scary. Putin just updated Russia's nuclear doctrine. Just so everyone's clear, a nuclear doctrine is basically a country's official stance on using nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah, it outlines the circumstances under which they might consider using them.
Okay, so Putin updated it, and this isn't just some bureaucratic formality. It's a major change in the conversation around this whole conflict. Can you break down what's changed in this doctrine?
One of the biggest changes is that Russia now considers any attack on its territory, or the territory of its ally Belarus, by a non-nuclear state that's supported by a nuclear power, like, say, the U.S., as grounds for a nuclear response.
So if I'm understanding this right, even if Ukraine used conventional weapons like the ADP-CMS, but those weapons were supplied by the U.S., Russia might see that as a reason to use nuclear weapons.
That's how it reads, yeah. And that creates a very dangerous and unpredictable situation. The West's trying to help Ukraine defend itself, but by giving them more advanced weapons, they risk pushing Russia into a corner. And in that corner, Russia might feel like their only option is to use nuclear weapons.
So even using conventional weapons could potentially lead to a nuclear conflict. That's a terrifying thought.
Well, this new doctrine is also a way for Russia to show off its power, flexing its nuclear muscles and trying to scare the West into backing off. They're trying to draw some very clear red lines.
So it's a mind game, a war of nerves.
Exactly. But even in a war of nerves, mistakes can have devastating consequences. It's vital to understand what both sides are thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. We need to look beyond the headlines and try to understand the bigger picture.
So we've got the embassy closure, the controversy over the ATACMS missiles, and now this very unsettling change to Russia's nuclear doctrine. Feels like everything is spiraling out of control, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely a very volatile situation. It's easy to get swept up in the day-to-day events. But we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. What are the long-term implications of these rising tensions? And maybe even more importantly, what does it mean for the average person listening to this right now?
Right. How does all this global stuff actually affect people's lives? There's got to be some ripple effects that go way beyond Ukraine and Russia.
You're absolutely right. The ripple effects of this conflict are already being felt globally. We're seeing the impact on energy prices, on food security, even on political stability around the world. As things continue to escalate, those impacts are only going to get worse, and they will affect all of us in one way or another. But there's another consequence, maybe even more significant, that we need to consider: the erosion of trust and the breakdown of communication between global powers.
That's interesting. Can you explain how these tensions are affecting global trust and communication?
Well, think about it. We're in a situation where a nuclear power is threatening to use its most destructive weapons in response to actions by a non-nuclear state that's being supported by other nuclear powers. The lines of communication are blurred, nobody's sure what anyone's motivations are, and the potential for miscalculation is enormous. This lack of trust, this breakdown of communication, it makes it almost impossible to find common ground, to de-escalate the situation, to find peaceful solutions.
And that's when things get really scary. Because if the world superpowers can't even talk to each other, if they can't understand each other's point of view, then the risk of accidentally stumbling into a conflict becomes much, much higher.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to understand how complex the situation is, and to have thoughtful conversations about the potential consequences. This isn't just about Russia and Ukraine. It's about the future of global security, the stability of the whole international order, and the very real threat of a nuclear conflict.
Okay, that's a lot to take in, and I know it's a lot for our listeners to take in as well. So before we get into the really heavy stuff, the potential consequences of all this, let's shift gears for a moment and look at the human cost of this conflict.
It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the political talk, but we can't forget that behind all of this are real people whose lives are being directly impacted by this war.
I can't lose sight of the human cost of this.
Millions of Ukrainians have lost their homes. Their lives have been completely turned upside down. And on the Russian side, you have soldiers, many of them young men who were drafted, being sent into a war they might not even understand or support.
It's a tragedy for everyone involved.
It is, and it just shows how important it is to find a way to de-escalate this situation, to find a peaceful solution.
Which seems almost impossible right now. Both sides seem so set in their ways.
It's definitely a daunting task. But history shows us that even the most difficult conflicts can eventually be resolved. It takes the right combination of pressure, incentives, and a willingness to compromise.
So what are some potential ways to de-escalate things? What does the solution to this conflict even look like?
Well, there are a few possibilities. None of them are easy or straightforward. One option is a negotiated settlement. Both sides would have to make some concessions to reach a ceasefire and agree on a framework for lasting peace. This would probably involve some kind of territorial compromise, security guarantees for both Ukraine and Russia, and a way to address the root causes of the conflict.
That sounds incredibly complicated. Is there any sign that either side is actually willing to compromise at this point?
It's hard to say for sure. Publicly, both sides are digging in their heels, repeating their demands, and accusing the other of not negotiating in good faith. But behind closed doors, there might be more room for flexibility.
So there's at least a little bit of hope.
Hope is always important, especially in situations like this, but hope alone isn't enough. It needs to be combined with a clear understanding of the risks, a commitment to dialogue, and a willingness to explore creative solutions.
We've been talking about this conflict in very strategic terms, focusing on military moves, political calculations, the threat of nuclear war. But there's another side to this that often gets overlooked: the economic impact.
You're right. The economic fallout from this conflict has been massive, and it reaches far beyond the immediate region. We're seeing energy prices skyrocketing, disruptions to global supply chains, and a ripple effect of economic instability that's affecting the entire world.
And this is something that hits everyone, not just people living in Ukraine or Russia. Rising gas prices are a direct result of this conflict, for example. It's a reminder that these global events have real consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. This is a global crisis, and we're all feeling the effects. For example, the rising cost of energy is a big problem for people. It's pushing up inflation and making it harder to pay bills. Businesses are also having a hard time dealing with the uncertainty and instability. which leads to job losses and a slower economy.
It's like one crisis triggers another.
Exactly, and it's important to understand that these economic consequences aren't just a side effect of the war. They're also a key factor in the decisions being made by those involved.
How so?
Take the sanctions against Russia. They're a powerful tool that the West is using to try and pressure Putin to back down. But those sanctions also have a big impact on the global economy. They drive up prices and create shortages. So it's a tricky situation. How do you punish aggression without causing more economic damage?
Yeah, that's a tough question with no easy answers. But it seems like we need to find a way to address both the security and economic aspects of this crisis if we want to find a real solution.
Absolutely. A comprehensive approach is essential. We need to think about not just how to stop the fighting, but also how to rebuild trust, restore economic stability, and create a framework for lasting peace and cooperation.
That sounds like a huge challenge.
It is. But the stakes are too high to give up hope. We need to break through this stalemate and create a more secure and prosperous future for everyone. And that starts with understanding how complex this situation is, engaging in constructive dialogue, and being open to different perspectives.
Okay, I think we need a moment to catch our breath. We've covered a lot of ground here. The immediate triggers of this crisis, the history between the U.S. and Russia, the potential ways to de-escalate things, and even the far-reaching economic consequences. But there's one crucial piece of this puzzle we haven't really talked about yet. The potential consequences of this escalation, especially the risk of a nuclear conflict.
You're right, that's the big one. And it can be a scary and difficult topic to talk about. But it's a conversation we need to have. The stakes are simply too high to ignore.
Absolutely. So let's take a deep breath and dive into this crucial and honestly terrifying topic.
All right. Let's do it. You know, the idea of a nuclear war is terrifying. It's something that could cause unimaginable destruction and suffering for the whole planet.
It's hard to even imagine how much destruction we're talking about.
The power of nuclear weapons is unlike anything we've ever seen. Just one detonation could wipe out an entire city and cause long-lasting environmental damage.
And with the number of nuclear weapons that both the U.S. and Russia have, even a small-scale exchange could have catastrophic consequences for everyone.
Exactly. We'd be looking at a global catastrophe. The radioactive fallout from multiple detonations wouldn't stay in one place. It would spread everywhere, contaminating the air, water, and soil. This could lead to widespread famine, disease, and the collapse of entire ecosystems. It's never happened before on this scale.
It's a truly scary thought. Some people might say that the risk of nuclear war is still pretty low.
Yeah.
That it's mostly just threats and posturing. What do you think?
It's true that nobody in their right mind wants a nuclear war, and both sides understand how devastating it could be. But the risk is still there, and that's what's so worrying. As tensions rise, the rhetoric gets more heated, communication breaks down, and the chances of miscalculation, accidents, things spiraling out of control, it all increases dramatically.
It's like playing a dangerous game of chicken. But the stakes are the survival of humanity.
That's a pretty accurate way to put it. That's why we need to take the threat of nuclear war very seriously, understand the risks, and work hard to de-escalate the situation and get rid of these weapons. We can't just sit back and assume that everything will be all right, especially when you have leaders with the power to launch these weapons who might be acting out of fear or desperation.
So what can we do? What can the average person do to help reduce the risk of nuclear war? It feels so overwhelming, like something we have no control over.
I know it's easy to feel helpless when faced with such a huge threat, but we're not powerless. We can make a difference. Every voice that speaks out against nuclear war, every action taken to promote peace and understanding, it all helps create a safer future for everyone. First and foremost, stay informed. Understand the issues, the history, what's happening right now in this conflict. Don't just rely on sound bites or social media for information. Dig deeper, find reliable sources, and form your own educated opinions.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
Exactly. Once you're informed, talk to others. Talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers about these things. Share what you've learned. Listen to their points of view. Encourage them to stay informed as well.
It's about starting a conversation, breaking the silence around this issue.
That's right. And don't underestimate what you can do. Contact your elected officials. Tell them that you care about nuclear disarmament, that you want them to prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation over military solutions. Support organizations that are working to reduce the risk of nuclear war. There are many groups dedicated to this cause, and they need our support now more than ever.
You've given us a lot to think about. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and even helpless when we face such a huge threat.
I understand. It's a difficult topic, but I want to stress that we're not powerless. We can make a difference. Every voice raised against nuclear war matters. Every action taken to promote peace and understanding counts. It all contributes to a safer and more secure future for everyone.
It's a powerful message, and one that we all need to hear right now. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't let this conversation end here. Keep learning, keep talking, keep speaking out. Because the future of our planet, the very survival of humanity, might depend on it.
Well said. Remember, even in the darkest of times, hope is not a luxury, it's essential. We have to hold on to hope, and we have to act on it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay safe, stay informed, and stay involved. We'll see you next time.
It's easy to get lost in the abstract when we talk about nuclear war, the unimaginable destruction, the impact on humanity as a whole, but we can't forget that these aren't just hypothetical scenarios, they're very real dangers with very real human consequences.
It's tough to really grasp the human cost of something like a nuclear war.
Exactly. Take nuclear winter, for example. Scientists believe that if there were a lot of nuclear explosions, there'd be so much dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere. It could block out the sun for years, causing global temperatures to plummet. That would be devastating for agriculture, leading to widespread famine, maybe even causing entire ecosystems to collapse.
So the initial destruction from the bombs would just be the start. We'd be facing all sorts of long-term problems. Problems that could threaten the very survival of our species.
That's right. And the effects of nuclear radiation wouldn't be limited to the areas hit by the bombs. Radioactive fallout can travel huge distances, carried by wind and weather patterns, contaminating water, crops, livestock, causing health problems for generations.
It's a scary reminder that we're all connected on this planet. What happens in one part of the world affects everyone else.
Absolutely. That's why we can't think of this conflict as something happening in a vacuum. It's not just about Russia and Ukraine. It's about the future of humanity. It's a wake-up call for all of us to do whatever we can to prevent a catastrophe like this.
Which brings us back to what we were talking about before. What can we as individuals do to make a difference in the face of such a huge threat?
I think the most important thing is to reject the idea that we're powerless. Every voice matters. Every action, no matter how small, can help to build a more peaceful and secure world.
So where should we start?
Start by talking to people. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share your worries. Listen to their opinions. Try to find some common ground. Don't let fear and apathy stop you. Become an advocate for peace. Contact your elected officials. Let them know that you support diplomacy and de-escalation.
And I'm sure there are organizations out there that are working to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Organizations that people can support.
Definitely. There are lots of grassroots organizations and international groups working hard to promote nuclear disarmament, conflict resolution, and global cooperation. These groups need our support more than ever. Even a small donation or volunteering your time can make a real difference.
It sounds like the key is to not give up hope, to turn those feelings of despair into positive action, even if it feels like a small thing.
You're absolutely right. The fight for peace is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks. There will be times when you doubt if it's worth it. But we can't give up hope. Every step we take toward a more peaceful world, no matter how small, is a step in the right direction.
You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to process, and most importantly, a lot to act on. This has been a sobering but very important look at one of the most urgent issues of our time.
It's been great sharing my thoughts with you. And even though things might look grim right now, always remember there's hope. We can never forget that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia. We hope you found it informative and got you thinking. We encourage you to keep talking about these things, stay engaged, and above all, never give up hope for a more peaceful and just world. Until next time, stay informed, stay safe, and take care.